Good morning, wherever you are. I'm Willie Drzymski. This is the Worship Reformation Podcast, the podcast where we discuss the theology and application of the classical or traditional style of Reformed congregational worship. To learn more about our ministry, check out worshipreformation.com. Today we're going to be looking at another common objection, and today's topic, objection, if you will, is one that occasionally I've not seen this one come up as frequently, but I have heard of it. I have heard people talk about this, and that is that modern worship music is too complex for the average congregant. Typically, it's another complaint with the modern contemporary style from people who really didn't really think about what they're saying in their complaint. Because if you look at a psalter or a hymnal, if the average congregant were to do that, if you were to take someone from your modern evangelical church and put a hymnal in the hands of the average congregant, have them look through it, open it up, and tell you what an A is, or even what, is that note higher or lower than this one? Is that one shorter or longer than that one? Their eyes would glaze over, and they would probably come away from that experience grateful that they don't have to look at that thick book and, all the confusing symbols and whatnot. And, it's just nice being with this modern style, and, they do all the hard work for you up there at the front, and they have the words on the screen for you. Just follow along when you're comfortable doing so, and you do your, you sing when you feel like it. So I would like to put forth the idea that the modern style, sure, it's complicated to an extent, but I would like to put forward the idea that the psalms and hymns that the church used to sing is way more complicated than your average hit piece from Hillsong. Unfortunately, this is a rather subjective topic, and because it's subjective, there are, many people try to justify the current state of affairs because, well, you can't give me an objective argument, concrete evidence that it's wrong to do. So there's that to deal with. So as we think through what we are allowed and not allowed to do in corporate worship, we should be careful to come at it from a logical perspective, but at the same time, all of our warning flags and red lights should come up when we hear a certain viewpoint being defended, because it's not specifically prohibited in Scripture. This is kind of the difference between the regulative principle and the normative principle of worship. The regulative principle being that if it's not in the Scripture, the regulative principle being that if it's not in the Scripture, we can't do it, and the normative principle being that if it's not prohibited in Scripture, then we can do it. But you'll kind of see that fleshed out a little more here in a bit. The Christian music industry is not built upon whether the piece in question, the song, is simple for the congregation to sing. And instead, it's professionally designed to produce a certain emotional, positive feeling in the listener, in the audience, and that results in a desire to keep listening to that song after it's ended. Give me the next one. I liked that. Let's put it on repeat. Download the album. I want more from this artist. So this is marketing at a pretty basic level. If the clients who bought your product the first time were impressed enough to buy it a second time, and if your method of selling it and making it, is if it works, and if it's the method by which you put food on the table, you're highly incentivized to, as a producer, to tailor your work after whatever people want. and figure out what people want and help them figure that out, and then pander to that regard. My point is that the most common use of modern worship music, it's in non-church related settings, and it's marketed to an audience not necessarily for church settings. Modern worship songs are played all day, every day, 7 days a week, on hundreds of radio stations and TV channels across the nation, as well as on, personal devices of every sort. And their high point kind of comes in the form of YouTube videos and music videos and whatnot. The question that all these producers are asking is not, will this work well in a congregation? What they're asking is, will this sell? Will it get people excited about what I'm doing? Not, I want to say selling music is not evil, and selling Christian music is certainly not evil if it's theologically correct and promoting good ideas, which the vast majority is not. I'll warrant, but that's beside the point. That's another podcast. The problem, I would say, lies with the expectation that whatever we do outside the church is appropriate for what we do in the church in corporate worship. But this is a flawed perspective. We don't execute corporate worship by having a feast, 1 Corinthians 11:22, or by sorting onions or making phone calls or doing business or by playing ragtime or listening to theologically sound Christian music on the radio even. These are all aspects of worship outside the corporate worship setting. Something different happens when we come as Christians into the presence of the Lord on Sunday mornings, and then we'll flush that out in a later podcast as well. But suffice it to say that it's different than worship done throughout the rest of the week. And so there is a differentiation. Now, the word worship, people try to use the word worship when they're talking about singing, but the reality is that whatever you do is worship, of course. So it gets a little confusing when we're talking about corporate worship versus normal worship in everyday life. Since we have lost the vision of what corporate worship is, our congregations and worship leaders are now wrongfully equating singing in church and corporate worship to what we listen to every day, to listening to someone else playing music on the radio, which we sing along to. That's not what we do in corporate worship. In corporate worship, the congregation makes music and sings, or it's supposed to, given all of the references we heard in the Psalms to the congregation singing. But what we're sliding into is this idea that, well, I listen to music in the car when I drive around, and I listen to it and at work, and I like this style, and I want to do this and do it this way in church. So we naively think to ourselves, why can't we do that at church? It's catchy and it gets me excited. And so the band, also kind of swimming in the same water that all the music producers are, seeks to pander to the congregation's spoiled appetite. But in doing so, it requires quite a bit of effort actually to take a song on the radio and then get people in your church to be able to produce and perform the same style of music. It actually takes some musical effort. People have to learn how to play the guitar and the drums and keys and all that sort of stuff like they do in the modern style of Christian music. And it is actually rather complicated because it was done by $1 million music industry. Now we have to bring it down to the level of what our congregation can perform and what our band can perform and all of that sort of stuff. So typically what happens is the band will simplify things. They'll take weird trills out and extra, frilly things. So for the average congregation, the result is actually pretty simple. It's the primary reason for the complexity of the original piece was, all the stylistic additions of the lead singer and the vocals and the background instruments. But if you strip all of these away, you're left with a very generic one-size-fits-all worship song. And what some of us discover is that this really doesn't look that well. It doesn't sound good, and it doesn't feel good when you sing it. Oftentimes, the original key of most of these worship songs is set very high because you have a professional singer, typically a male singing in a very high key, and not a lot of guys can hit that. And so you typically drop the music and all of that sort of stuff. But it's still a very one-size-fits-all approach, and it gets kind of painfully obvious. There's one melody line, for instance, which is the main tune, and maybe there's also typically there's kind of a vague alto line somewhere in there thrown in unofficially by the female accompaniment to the lead singer. But most of the time there's no tenor and there's no bass except as played by the bass guitar, and that's typically below the range of most guys, and it's not very musically interesting either. And even with a lot of the old, with the hymns that people have started to transpose to modern styles, the bass guitar will do a bass line that's completely different. That's a little bit of a tangent, but when the only way to really make the modern style sound interesting is to add all of these extra trills and frills and stylistic additions that most congregations just aren't going to pick up on. And so when you take all of it out, you have a stick-framed house with no siding and no windows, and it's all just kind of bare bones, and it really is quite a bit less complicated than your average hymn. But you heard it on the radio, so it's cool that you're singing it, and it feels nice, I guess, to some people. For me, I've broadened my taste. I want to be careful how much I promote my own taste, of course, but it's just a lot more fun to be able to sing a complicated song well and to actually have it sound good in church with all the other people who you're meeting with on Sunday morning. So taking a look at the average hymn, especially ones that are composed a while ago, over 150 years ago, it becomes painfully obvious that the musical standard of our day is pretty outrageously low by comparison. 4-part harmonies and fairly odd rhythms in the case of the Genevan Psalter are fairly entry level. Not to mention different parts coming in and out, and that's called a fuguing tune. If you have the tenor comes in, the bass comes in, and then the alto, and then the soprano, and everybody kind of sings a different type of part, and they all join up together again at the end. That's also fairly common when you get into older hymns. When when you compare the two styles, there's not a comparison to be made. Hymns and the psalms set to meter are vastly more complex from a musical standpoint, if for no other reason than what they expect the congregation to be able to do, to be able to sing. It's assumed that the melody line is known by all the participants, but there are usually other parts. There's 3 other parts typically. It's alto and tenor and bass. And all these are designed for the other vocal ranges inside of the congregation. So if you're an average congregant singing, say, bass, you're going to have to know what the melody sounds like, and you're also going to have to know how your bass part sounds like. You're going to have to be able to sing your bass part while somebody else sings a different part than you. And you're also going to have to learn how to fit your part in to match the timing of the main part of the melody part. So it's a fairly complicated set of skills to have. And this is especially true of a fuguing tune where you have different parts coming in and out. Now this style could be likened to a house with a lot of windows framed with complex architecture, but with less curtains and frills on the inside and furniture and whatnot. Whereas the modern contemporary style is just all frills and nothing else. So I've heard from the contemporary crowd that there aren't enough curtains, and this makes sense because they live in a house where you can't see the window because of the curtains. So I've primarily focused on the musical style rather than the lyrics because it's a more difficult subject to tackle, but the depth of our modern worship lyrics really doesn't compare to the 99% of what you'll find composed during the couple hundred years after the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. And I don't think this should be really controversial given the quite mindless, repetitive lyrics that we find in modern contemporary worship songs. It seems to be that they find the artist will find a catchy line and they like how it sounds, and then they just kind of roll with that and use that over and over and over again. The theological depth of the modern song is quite a bit less, and there's really not a good comparison to be made there. People have told me that the older hymns are outdated and most folks wouldn't understand the meaning of these old words and terms that they use. And if you were to introduce songs like that today, it would be sinful not to immediately break down the words and explain them to the congregation beforehand in modern parlance so that they knew what they would be singing. And I think this is a rather short-sighted way of looking at the human level of intelligence. People aren't that dumb, I don't think. If you were to, in the way that we learn language, if you set a 3-year-old in a completely different country, eventually he'll pick up the language, and it'll be fairly quick, in fact. Quicker than an adult, of course, but people will eventually figure out what a word means just by seeing the context in which it is used. And if you hear older language over and over again, it will eventually be easier to figure out, what it means and how it's used and what these older styles of lyrics are getting across. God did not make a simple world. He made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that dwell therein, of course, and not all at once. He decided that it would be best to stretch this out over 7 days before charging Adam and his wife to go out and subdue this earth, take dominion over it, be fruitful and multiply and all that. And for 6,000 years, we have been trying to wrap our heads around his creation. We have not yet gotten to the bottom of the things and the complexity and the sophistication that God has put into this earth. It is incredibly complex. And why is this? Well, it's to give God glory and honor. Complexity in God's creation is a wonderful thing, and much ink is spilled in the Psalms rendering praise to this fact. And so, for that reason, I don't think we should spurn the creating of our own complex and beautiful things, which takes skill to produce and which takes skill to perform. In fact, this is what God has called us to do by way of the creation mandate. We are called to be fruitful and multiply and rule over the earth, and we are told to create things in it by following the example that God laid out for us during the week in which the earth was created. We do work for 6 days, we rest on the 7th. And to say that God is honored when we strive for musical excellence and complexity, in just the same way as when we do nothing of the sort, is a pietistic lie. It's, we are, the fact that we can give God glory by using the intelligence he has given us, it's an amazing thing. It's a gift that we have, and we should use it. So we must be skillful, striving for excellence in everything we accomplish, and especially to include our worship of the Lord. King David was praised by Saul's men for being a skillful musician, and then they referenced his valor, his prudence in speech, and his good looks after they praised him for being a skilled musician. That was the first thing that came to mind for them. And First Chronicles, we're introduced to a man named Chenaniah, the chief of the Levites, who was in charge of the singing, and it was his job to lead the singing because he was really good at it, not because he just happened to like it or enjoy it or knew some cool beats or whatnot. But he was skilled at singing, and that's why he had that role. So clearly we have a worthy goal to strive for, so don't let them tell you that it's the thought that counts, of course. Interesting little side note, and I think it was in January 2024, I found a YouTube video of a guy who had programmed an AI to compose a modern worship song, and at the face value, it was pretty simplistic, and it sounded very very middle of the road, general, what an AI does. It sounded like the real thing, but it was a very It didn't. The song did not say anything. The lyrics were really poor, but it kind of just sounded like the typical feel-good, fluffy encouragement with no theological grounding, typical of your average evangelical contemporary worship song. So he put some, he put some effort into making it sound decently good by putting programming in here and feeding it stuff there. Anyway, it was all pretty convincing. He published the recording on several music platforms, and it did fairly well in terms of the numbers it was getting, and it actually did better than anything that he had composed in the past, which wasn't very, very flattering, but it was interesting. And then somebody at CCLI caught it, and not from a caught it from a found you out sort of standpoint, but they caught wind of this new song that had come out, and then it exploded, and everybody was going wild over this new song, and so he eventually pulled it back off because it was he just felt bad for people. The second half of his experiment was he tried to compose a modern, an older hymn. I shouldn't say modern. He tried to compose an old hymn using the same AI, and it just failed horribly. To come up with anything remotely meaningful in the lyrics, and he just kind of gave up there. Why was the original contemporary worship song that he wrote convincing? Well, it was because it was realistic and that it had all the good feels and it said nothing. Yeah, but for the average radio consumer, not much attention is paid to whether the lyrics make sense as long as they sound good and they're predictable. So hopefully the case has been made here that psalms and hymns set to the metered four-part harmonies are in fact far more complicated, both in their musical style and in their theological depth, than your average piece broadcast on what is called Christian radio. So, and this is a good thing. This isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing. We should be striving for complexity and knowledge and and skill and how to sing these complex songs. God is honored when we work hard to produce good music for His glory, and doing so is a worthy pursuit to which we are called. We should therefore not be surprised when we find it difficult to accomplish. So until next time, sing heartily, sing daily, and sing psalms. This is Worship Reformation.